back to MFA Writers. Before we get to our special episode today with George Saunders, I just wanted to give a quick thank you to all of you who have reached out to us via email and social media. We've gotten a lot of really nice notes recently, some from listeners who have used the podcast as a resource when applying to MFA programs, and others from writers outside of academia. When we created this podcast, we hoped it would be a helpful and entertaining resource for all emerging writers. Whether you're looking for information on MFA programs, interested in hearing craft discussions with fellow writers, or looking to discover some great up-and-coming talent. So we're really excited to see that vision come to fruition, and we just want to thank all of you for your support and for letting us know that you're enjoying it. It really means a lot to us. If you want to reach out, you can find MFA Writers on Instagram and Twitter, as well as mfawriters.com. We love to hear from listeners, so feel free to shoot us a direct message on one of those platforms or an email at mfawriterspodcast@gmail.com. And if you have a minute to rate or review the show, the best place to do that is on Apple Podcasts. Doing so will help boost our podcast as we try to boost these amazing writers. Also, if you or someone you know would like to be a guest on the show, you can apply at mfawriters.com. Finally, as always, thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome to MFA Writers, the podcast where we talk to creative writing MFA students about their program, their process, and a piece they're working on. I'm your host, Jared McCormick. Today we've got a special episode with someone who needs no introduction, but I'm going to give him one anyway. George Saunders is the author of 11 books, including 10th of December, which was a finalist for the National Book Award, Lincoln in the Bardo, which won the Man Booker Prize, and most recently, A Swim in a Pond in the Rain. He studied in the creative writing program at Syracuse and later joined the faculty there, where he currently teaches as part of their MFA program. He's joining us today to talk about writing, teaching, and his new project, Story Club, a twice-weekly newsletter hosted on Substack. George, thanks so much for being here.
Jared, thanks for having me. Good to be here.
So many listeners of this podcast are emerging writers who are somewhere in the process of figuring out what kind of writers they can and want to be. And I think there's this tendency to look at successful writers such as yourself and think they were always great at this thing, like they were born that way or something. But you've had a winding path to where you are now. Your degree is in geophysics from the Colorado School of Mines. You worked as a geophysical prospector in Indonesia and a technical writer in Rochester, New York, before you found the writing success that's brought you to this point. So what do you remember from that time when you were still trying to figure it out that you could share with those of us who are now at a similar point in our careers, hoping to one day get where you are today?
Yeah, that's a great one. I guess mostly looking back now, I'm kind of amazed by how, almost like stupidly single focused I was. I didn't have a plan B. I didn't really, I just didn't really have anything in my sights except to try to get a book out, I guess. Although, also I'm amazed by how, slow I was. Like, I'd say at 24, 25, I knew I wanted to write, but I wasn't reading that much and I wasn't writing that much. And when I did write, I didn't like it. I was trying to just get it over with. So, if I could go back, I wish I would just tell myself to sort of be more intense about it. But on the other hand, I guess I was being exactly as intense as I could, So I definitely a path that was all over the place and, kind of like my first book actually came out until I was 38 and I started publishing it maybe in my early 30s. But so, I think it makes me pretty, merciful as a teacher. Like it's not, the case a teacher can predict who's going to make it or, anything. It's just a very loose kind of mysterious, path. And I think my own journey kind of just reminds me of that all the time. You just never know with writing, So a little bit of humility in teaching and maybe a little bit of humility as a aspiring writer too, to say, well, there's me, there's the person I am in my everyday life, and then there's my talent. And they're not identical. So when you're young, the person you are is usually, as Ira Glass said, more advanced than the talent. And that's frustrating. But I guess I would say, to my young self, be merciful with that talent. Because it's trying, it's trying to get up on its feet. And your job as a person in the world is to give it some room to do that, I guess.
But keep working at it, I guess.
Yeah, or not, also like sometimes, if it's not working, maybe take a break it's really like almost, if you got married to somebody, kind of arranged marriage, you'd spend some time going, who is that person? How do I manage this person? And same with your talent.
Well, that's interesting because, I was curious about that time that you spent abroad. Like you worked in Indonesia for a while and then you came back to the States, and after your writing program, I think you were working in Rochester, New York for a bit. And I was wondering how important those experiences, those like real world working experiences were to your development as a writer.
Yeah, I think they were really important. And also at the time, I kind of knew that. Like I had grown up on writers like Steinbeck and Dos Passos, who were kind of known for being really forward about being in the world and trying to, go places that weren't comfortable and understand the politics of the time by immersing themselves in it. So I think it was sort of economic necessity, and it was also sort of self-consciously priming the pump a little bit. And I think, the simplest way to say it is it actually gave me something to write about, because I didn't, I wasn't born with a bunch of ideas I wanted to express. And I remember as a young writer going, God, I wish I just had a theme. I wish I had a view of the world, but I don't. And I think going out and doing those things, especially a little later when Paul and I had kids, then suddenly, a theme was just what keeps you up at night. What are you worried about? What's degrading you? Why is your grace being forfeited? So I think all those experiences, which are, kind of working experiences, were really important, just because they changed who I was. I still, am a subscriber to that sort of old fashioned idea that a writer's job is to get out in the world and see what she thinks of it, and, then bring back some messages. So I think that was my way of, kind of blundering out into the world and getting my ass kicked a little bit and then going, oh, okay, so I now understand with more sympathy, other people's suffering and other people's anger and other people's just their plight,
Yeah, I had a similar experience. I grew up in a small town and then went to college and then graduated from college and realized I still didn't know anything. That's how I felt when I graduated. And so I went abroad and traveled and taught abroad for like 8 to 9 years and came back with like this, just a better sense of the world, a better sense of my privilege and place in the world. And just, I thought suddenly an ability to write things that I thought mattered more than what I was writing before.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I think in a way, what you're trying to do is put yourself in connection with the rest of the world, So when you are writing a character who's jealous, you understand, or a person, a radical extremist, you understand to some extent that viewpoint. So I think that's really healthy. And, it's sort of a version of believing in the rest of mankind, like saying, well, here I am, I'm raised in this particular place with this particular mind. Now I'm going to go out and see how it looks to other people in the faith that that's going to enlarge my whole project, And I think, the way it manifested for me was that suddenly, at one point early on, I would write a character and go, who gives a shit? Who cares? I don't care what happens to this person. And then after all this happened and I started really working on my first book, it seemed like even small things mattered. Like you could have a character in a small fix, and somehow I was more tuned into that as a kernel of a story. So I think really what happened was I started to care more about other people because I had gotten myself into a little bit of difficulty just with having a family and no money and no prospects. My sympathy got turned on a little bit, which is a really important thing for stories.
Well, I'm curious, before you started your family, you had this experience of studying creative writing in the graduate program at Syracuse. I'm curious if, in retrospect, there were ways that studying in that program were beneficial to you, or if there were other ways that were not so beneficial to you in your growth as a writer.
Yeah, I mean, the beneficial strikes me because I was such a clod. Like I wasn't reading, and I think I was sort of coasting on my natural arrogance, that when I decide to do this, I can do it. And then to get dropped in with a bunch of other talented people and go, oh gosh, I'm not actually that special. And then I have to now figure out, if I am, and if I am, how I am. That was really good. Just to be dropped into the lobster pot and go, hey, how am I different from these other lobsters, you know? And I think too, to see our teachers working, you know, Tobias Wolff and Douglas Unger, to see them being really good teachers and people, but then somewhere in their life they were off there working like crazy, and you know, and neither one of them was like, you know, sword fighting or you know, going on wild binges. I mean, they were really responsible, good people, and they were crazy, wild artists. That was good for me to see, because I still had a little bit of that kind of Kerouac idea, you know, that if you could tell how good a writer somebody was by how insane they were or how badly they behaved or something. So it was a nice kind of permission giving to see them and go, oh, so, you know, kind of like if you want to be a good writer, you got to write good. That's it. You know, the lifestyle accoutrements actually don't matter that much at all. So that was valuable. I don't think there was any, for me, coming from where I came from, there was no downside, because my arrogance had to get burned off. And I didn't write particularly well when I was in the program, but it kind of put a bunch of stuff in me that came to fruition later. But as a teacher, you know, it's interesting. I think part of the contract has to be, we don't know if this is going to be good for you or not.
Right.
You know, we don't guarantee it. It's going to be hopefully an intense experience. It might be an intensely positive one. It might be an intensely negative one, but it's almost like, I guess like crushing a bunch of coal, you know. I don't know if this is true geologically, but some of the coal might be a diamond, some might not. I think you have to sort of buy into that if you're a student entering an MFA program, to say, well, I love this thing so much and I want to do it so badly that I'm going to risk possibly a negative experience in the hopes that it'll speed me along the path.
Well, that leads me into my next question, because you've been teaching in the MFA program at Syracuse for over 20 years now. And like you said, a lot of people pursue the MFA, but not everyone has a great experience with it. And with this podcast, like one of the things we're trying to do is just be really open about what it's like to be in an MFA program, so that people can have as much information as possible and make those decisions for themselves and like manage their expectations before going in.
Great.
So I was curious if, you know, like over the years, I imagine over the years, you've seen a lot of students struggle, a lot of students succeed at Syracuse and to varying degrees. So do you have any advice for anyone who's considering an MFA and ways to get the most out of the experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing would be, you know, just know that everyone is different. It's kind of like if someone said, I want to, you know, join a football team. You're like, well, which one, you know? So that's something to really think about, is that each program has its own ethos and its own flavor. And part of that is funding, you know, like one of the things I really love about Syracuse is that everybody gets funded, and there's not that mad competition for scarce resources. I mean, all the resources are scarce, but everybody gets the same, you know. That's something I think maybe gets a little undermentioned, just that the atmosphere in a program where everybody's approximately funded the same way is going to be really different from one where 3 kids get everything and the other 80 get nothing. That's just going to be different. It also affects the way you think of it. Like if you think, okay, I have to go $80,000 or whatever it is in debt to be a writer of fiction, that's a certain thing. Whereas if you say, okay, I'm going to basically break even if I live cheap, that's a whole different ballgame. And the latter one, I think, is, at least from my mindset, would be much more prone to make success. It's just less pressure. And then I think the other thing I tell our students is try not to think of it as school and try not to think of it as social. So, you know, the natural impulse, you show up at the campus in fall, it looks like a campus. You take as many classes as you can. You try to be, you know, like an ideal student. You try to go to all the parties. And for some people, that's great. But I think that it's just a subtle shift of focus to say, for once in your life, you know, I'm here for selfish reasons. I really want to speed myself along during this 2 or 3 years to get as far as I can. So then you're going to go to office hours. You're going to ask the stupid question. You're going to do everything you can to exploit those 3 years, knowing that, you know, you might never get that relative ease again. So it's just a slight adjustment in mindset from, I'm here to be a good citizen. I'm here to be well liked. I'm here to, you know, take as many free hours as I can, to no, I'm here to, get closer to my book, basically, you know. So that's, and you can see that, you know, some students will kind of get into the, you know, they have that elation on first getting into a program, which can be distracting. And, you know, the feeling that they've already accomplished a thing by getting in, which of course isn't true. And then, you know, there's the period of getting your feet on the ground. And then sometimes people just kind of get into the whatever's going on in the program. There could be something social, something political, something whatever, a little controversy, and then pretty soon the 3 years is gone. Whereas in my view, the preferred thing is to kind of always keep the mantra, this is about my book. And that will kind of, guide you, but who knows? I mean, then again, who knows? It could be that somebody really needs to socialize to write well. So anything is fair game.
Well, almost exactly a year ago, you released your newest book titled A Swim in a Pond in the Rain, in which 4 Russians give a masterclass on writing, reading, and life. Your inspiration for this book was a class you've taught on Russian literature, but I imagine you've taught many different classes in your time at Syracuse. So what made you want to write about this class in particular?
Well, that was always my best. That was the best. We have kind of there's a workshop type classes, and then there's what we call forms classes, which is kind of like literature for writers. And so I have taught a number of those, but the Russian one was the one I would think was best at. And it was always kind of the most lively one. So a few years ago, I just come off a book tour and I hadn't taught in a while, and I just thought, oh my God, I love teaching that Russian class so much. And collectively between me and, probably 9 or 10 different groups of really brilliant students, we really learned a lot about those things, and you talk about the same stories every year, you get into kind of a rich zone of understanding them. So I kind of had this just slightly morbid feeling like, well, if I kick the bucket tomorrow, all of that goes with me because I'm the only one who is there for all of it, So it just felt a little bit, it was a different feeling, instead of, I get a certain feeling when I want to write a story. This was a little different. It was, maybe a little bit PSA, like I want to, I want to do this, thing for literature, kind of something like that, a little corny. But, so it was just that feeling of wanting to kind of just sort of do something with all those years of teaching, I guess.
I guess when you sit down to write a short story, you often don't know what it's going to be when you sit down to write it. But here you have this wealth of knowledge that it's there, you can write it down and you just have to do it.
Well, that's what I thought, and you're right. And that was my initial thing was, I'll spend 4 months and type up my notes. And then charmingly, like a story, the material was like, hey, dumbass, you don't know me as well as you think you do. You've been teaching me, but you never tried to write me before. And that was a real moment of truth. I'm like, oh, this is not a 6 month. This might be a 2 or 3 year thing because you have the, in class, you can kind of lead the horse to water. You lead these brilliant students to you ask a question and then they answer it. That's a great class. But in the essay form, you have to ask it and then make some attempt to answer it. So it was hard. And there's just a certain moment where I went, oh, this is so worth it. I'm learning so much. And, it was just a nice feeling. It was like, politics were weird. And I think the pandemic was kind of firing up and it was just nice to go, okay, look, I'm so confused about everything, but in this one realm, we can know what's true. We can read a Chekhov story over and over again and say some things about it and then, express that precisely. And that was really a pleasure, kind of a grounding pleasure.
Well, I think the book arrived just on time. It was, last January, 2021, stuck inside for however long we'd been in there. And then to get this book and feel like I was back in the classroom in a way, it was really nice.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, it's a book that nobody would read if they had the option of going outside.
At what point, you mentioned earlier that like when you were younger, you weren't reading as much as you feel like you should have been. So at what point did you find these Russian writers? At what point did you start reading Russian literature? And what have these Russian masters meant to you in your writing?
I think I knew of them, weirdly, and this is kind of maybe a symptom of a working class life is I knew about them because of the movie Dr. Zhivago. I saw that movie with Omar Sharif and Julie Christie, and it was so romantic. And so, because of that movie, I think I remember reading a little Tolstoy and a little Dostoevsky in college just on the side. And then when I was in the oil fields, I took one of my breaks. I went to Russia just because of that kind of hazy sense that Russia was a very romantic country, So it was a little bit at a time. And then, when I got to Syracuse, I tell the story in the book, but Toby Wolfe, read from Chekhov. It was one of the evening readings and he read the Gooseberries trilogy. And that was really, for me, the kind of the real beginning of it. Cause it was the first time I'd understood fiction to be kind of everything. It was funny. It was deep. It was sad. It was all those things at once. And, more so than any movie or anything like that. It was just really thrilling. So then I started reading them more. And then when I came to teach at Syracuse some years later, I had to teach this forms class. And I thought, well, I'll use that as an excuse to read a bunch of Russian stories. And so it was kind of a little bit at a time, over the years. And I'm still not an expert. Like I haven't read, there's a whole level of obscure or more obscure Russian writers I haven't read. So my claim is just that I've read a handful of these stories, maybe 30 or 40 of them, really attentively with a lot of love over the years, and have sort of developed a take on them.
Well, your newest project, a newsletter on Substack called Story Club, is really an extension of this book. It includes more discussions of craft and life and process and stories, though it's no longer solely focused on Russian stories. The first one discussed in depth for Story Club was Cat in the Rain by Ernest Hemingway. So in what ways do you imagine the lessons in Story Club being different or similar to the chapters in A Swim in a Pond in the Rain?
Oh, yeah. Well, what I'm finding is that I have, not as much time to revise, obviously, as I did with the book. So, because the book was kind of like I'd write an essay on a Chekhov story and then 5 or 6 times over the next 2 years come back to it with that distance, between reads and stuff. So these, it's a little more participatory because the plus side is you have the comments. So you're actually teaching to an active, dynamic group of people who can answer back. So I'm still kind of trying to figure it out. There's, because ideally in class, you'd assign the story 1 week. The students would have a week to read it and work on it and kind of develop ideas and questions about it. And then you come in the next week and go for it. So I'm trying to kind of mimic that a little bit. But so the benefit is, people, I think we have over 20,000 people now on the other end. And so that's really been fun. And part of the energy is to see how crazily enthusiastic they are. Like we just I posted an exercise maybe 3 or 4 days ago that I use at Syracuse. And we have, I think, over 1,000 responses, many of which are, short stories in response to the prompt. So that for me is really exciting. And I think I teach less now than I used to. I got a reduced teaching load. And this has really been a nice substitute. I just love that energy of saying, when the teacher and the student are kind of selflessly putting their heads together over a work of literature for no ulterior motive, just because they love it. I find that really energizing and hopeful. And, so I'm loving it so much more than I thought it was going to.
Yeah, that's been one of the really cool parts for me as well. I actually wrote a review of A Swim in a Pond in the Rain for New Letters magazine when it came out. And at the time, I thought that book was the closest most of us would get to taking a class with you at Syracuse. But like you mentioned, it was missing that sense of community, like the ability to read something and other people are reading it too and then discuss it in some way. And I feel like Story Club is really taking us one step closer.
I'm really trying, and I'm trying to it's interesting to have this new format and try to figure out hacks, we're doing a story next week and I just recorded it, the whole thing. So in class, sometimes I used to read a short story aloud. So I'm looking for ways to keep that intimacy. And it's really nice to kind of, I've been trying to be pretty energetic about, reading the comments. So, in an MFA program, one advantage is that someone actually reads your work in line edits. I can't do that in this context. But the other one is that sense where, let's say you and I work together, or even we just go to a party and you tell me a story from your childhood or something. I kind of log that in my mind as a teacher, and I'm like, okay, I know him a little bit better than I did. And then over the time at Syracuse, you get to see, oh, I see this person has these issues, or there's this little bit of an obstruction in their work. What's the personal corollary? That kind of thing. So at the moment of your choosing, you can sometimes just give a little poke, a little, nudge. The person might not even know that's what it was. So there's sort of an approximation of that in the comments. I can, sometimes I'll be scanning and someone will very sincerely, admit some problem they're having, and, to kind of get a conversation going there and see what happens. So it's been pretty rich, and I love that it's an experiment. I don't really know how long it can be sustained. It could be a year, it could be 10. I don't know.
And I imagine it's something that's going to evolve as you go. Like you said, you're kind of figuring it out. So I imagine, there will be strategies you'll find that work and others that don't. But one thing that's been really cool, I think, is that, like you mentioned, you've been engaging with the comments. So there's been this overwhelming amount of engagement from the people in the class, and then you're popping in from time to time to interact with those comments, which has been really cool.
Yeah, it's fun. And, it's like I said, it's kind of, for me, it's part of the responsibility of it. I think when I first started, I thought, I just won't even look at the comments. And then you're like, yeah, but that's like being in a class where you never ask how you're doing, or like when the students start talking, you walk out of the room. I mean, so I kind of like that feeling of, I also kind of like, this might be a little arrogant, but I like the thought that collectively we could kind of tame social media a little bit, like so far the tone of that thing is so positive, you know, and people are not being personal. They're just, being very generous with each other. And that's kind of interesting that can happen, because there's a lot of people on there. And even that cat in the rain, it's, there's a lot of potential for that to go in the wrong direction because of there's kind of a sexist undertone and all that kind of stuff. But people have just been remarkably, precise and generous in their comments. So I love that. It makes me feel happy, to think that the world isn't all snark.
Well, we talked about earlier, I think we're all a little bit uneasy in the world right now, and we've been stuck inside for much of the last couple of years, just taking in information. Most of that information is very negative and very scary.
Yeah.
And to have this place where it's just overwhelmingly positive and overwhelmingly happy and supportive place, which I've never seen, honestly, in the comments section of anything on the internet.
Somebody in the comments mentioned that Joan Didion, may she rest in peace, talking about the jitters. And I think we've got that right now, the jitters, that people are, you think of it, I'm reading a book now about totalitarianism, and I think it's Anna Abramson, maybe I may get her name wrong, but she makes a really interesting point that we are right now getting so much input. So more than any human being has ever had before. And it makes for agitation, and especially when so much of that has been kind of algorithmically twisted to both support our existing view and to sort of prioritize snark and agitation. It's going to have an effect on people. And you add in the pandemic and all that. So it just occurred to me, like through the Story Club, that it's actually an objective good to just make a place for people to be nice to each other for a bit, It sounds silly. It sounds kind of trivial or new age, but, from my own reaction to go on there and go, oh my God, there's 500 really thoughtful, positive people out there. That helps me, so I have to assume it has the same effect for them as well.
Yeah. There have been moments even when I was, scrolling through the comments and maybe there was a slight misunderstanding or disagreement, and then it's followed up immediately by a discussion over what that disagreement was or that misunderstanding and apology, and then moving on to something positive again.
Well, part of it, Substack is kind of cool in that I have the power to block comments, which I've only had to do once so far. But my thought is, well, it's like a classroom. So if somebody speaks disrespectfully to somebody else and I happen to catch it, then I have an obligation to correct it. But for the most part, it's been completely self-guided on the part of the group. And, that's an incredible platform to work from, because now what we're going to do, as I do at Syracuse, is start thinking about, okay, how do we critique a story with real specificity? So get out of the simple judgment phase and into the true analysis. How do we do that, first of all? Because it's a pretty specific process, and some people can do it and some people can't, but everybody can learn it. And then the second thing is, okay, now how does this start to trickle down into our own work? And I don't actually know the answer to that. It's always been a kind of an open box in my teaching, is like we do a close reading of Hemingway. How does that help our work? That's an interesting thing to think about, but it's really great to have such a positive group to work with, to try to feel these things out a little bit. And then the bigger question is, does any of this have anything to do with the larger cultural conversation? Is there anything of value in what we're doing when we start thinking about the public sphere and how to talk to one another and so on?
Well, you mentioned that you are recording the next lesson that you're going to put on there. Maybe you can give listeners a sense of the kinds of activities that you hope to do. So far, like I mentioned, the Cat in the Rain story by Ernest Hemingway, you used that same technique that you used in the first chapter of A Swim in a Pond in the Rain. You've done some lessons that are mainly focused specifically on craft and process and revision. Where do you see this going from here? Do you have some interesting ideas for different directions to go in?
I hope so. The main thing I have is a core of right now about I got 5 stories that we've got permission for. That's a part I didn't realize you have to, get permissions. So, but the idea is to have a kind of a spine of great stories that we'll look at together, lined up. And then the way I'm imagining is that I'll intersperse those with exercises and examples. I'm going to bring in some edits from my own work. We did one thing with a story of mine called The Falls, where we read it, and I just kind of said, well, here's how it was for me. I'm trying to be as frank as possible, not dress it up in the usual way, but just say, here's how it really, happened. So it's kind of a mix of those things. And the nice thing I'm finding, well, the complicated thing, I thought I would just write like 15 things and take a break,
Right.
But it's the real value of this is the interactive stuff. So, to do that, the cat in the rain and go, okay, so this is something that needs to be addressed now, or this, it would be natural to now write about this or talk about this based on reviewing the comments. So that means you can't really get too far ahead, because otherwise again, it's like, putting a tape on in your class and walking out. So that's going to be challenging to just kind of shape the thing in response to the needs of the group. And I'm sure when I'm done with it, I'll say, oh, I could have organized that differently. But for now, I've got some kind of, I want to do some stuff on revision, like real specific stuff about how to cut and how to rearrange and that. I want to write I've got a list of about 15 essays I want to write during the course of it. So, but the main thing that's enlivening it for me is to say, okay, there's not a syllabus, but there's a responsiveness to whatever actually happens tomorrow on the page.
Well, that frankness that you mentioned, I think, is one of my favorite things about Story Club so far. There's been a lot of honesty and openness on your part about the revisions that you've made to past stories. And you've also talked about how your stories still sometimes get rejected, which kind of blows my mind. And you also talk about how teaching writing is really difficult because what works for one writer might not work for another, and what works for one story might not work for the next story. So what do you think are some of the biggest difficulties in teaching fiction? And with those in mind, how do you try to approach it?
Yeah, well, the biggest difficulty, I guess, like anything, is you would prefer to go on autopilot. You'd prefer to have, especially, if you've been doing it a while, you want to have just a way of doing it that's constant. And that is, the opposite of what we have to do. I found out, early on when I was teaching, I hadn't really, I didn't have a degree in English, and I had been an engineer. And so I kind of blundered into the classroom, and I had a moment of truth where I was like, okay, I'm not going to be able to bullshit these kids. They're too smart. So why am I here? What do I have to offer them? And at that point, the only thing I had to offer them was that I had published one book. So I thought, okay, then the best thing you can do is be really honest about that process, including the bumps and the doubts and the mistakes and all that. And even be really honest about my own feelings of being an imposter in the classroom. So that turned out to be a real energy saver, because at that level, the level of the students at Syracuse, and I'm sure the level of a lot of your listeners, they really are hungry to be better, and they're afraid that they might not make it, and they're desperate for advice. And mostly what they want, I think, is honesty. So, if I get a story rejected and tell them that, they appreciate it, and there's something valuable. There was a thing that happened when I was at Syracuse that really was instructive. Doug Unger had a book out, and he got a pretty mean-spirited review in the Times. And, we'd all read it over the weekend, and we came in the workshop like, what's going to happen here? And I think we mostly thought he'll avoid the subject, and we will too. That'll be great. The first thing he did was hold up the article and said, let's talk about this. And he was so courageous and generous about it. And, he said, some of this is right. This right here probably isn't right. But he just was so selfless in the way that he was willing to use that to benefit us. He could have just ignored it. He could have dissed the writer, but he took it really seriously, and he kind of modeled what it meant to be a writer, that it wasn't always glory, and he basically, the gist of it was, and tomorrow I'm going back and work again. That's it, So I think that saves you as a teacher a lot of trouble. You don't have to fake anything, pretend you know things you don't, pretend that, that kind of thing where you think the teacher has some secret that he's keeping from you. That's a lot of work if you're the person doing the forgery, so.
Well, in one of the posts that you did the other day, you encouraged writers to overwrite, then radically scale back in revision. And that really resonated with me in an interesting way. I didn't read that and think, I've never thought of that before. But instead I read it and thought, hey, there's that thing that I've been feeling. And if George Saunders
Right.
feels it too, then maybe it's okay for me to just trust my intuition more. And it made me think that maybe that's what teaching creative writing is all about, showing writers that it's okay to trust their intuition.
I think that's 100% right. Because what else do you have? If I give you some factoid that it doesn't seem familiar to you and you have to keep it in mind, that's a big pain in the butt. You can't do that, know. But if I simply say something, you go, oh, I know that already, then you're great. You're set for the rest of your life. So it's that plus a certain element of saying, and I maybe say this too much, but I really mean it. Here's how it was for me. Does that resonate with you at all? If so, yay. If not, flush it. In other words, you have to keep reminding myself there is no method, even mine, So it's almost like, maybe if a tree fell on somebody and you were like, does it help at all if you tense that muscle up? No? Okay, don't do that. Does it help at all if you think of your childhood home? Okay, you don't really know what it's like to be stuck under that particular tree, but you're making suggestions. And so and this might go back to your earlier question about how to do an MFA. For the student, I would say the ideal mindset is, I'll try it.
Right. And
I'll reject it if needed. Not I'll try it, absolutely, but I'll temporarily submit to your lowercase authority, and I will see with my own development in mind radically. I'll see if anything resonates with me. If it does, thank you very much. I'm keeping this since it was mine to start with. And if it doesn't, I'll very lovingly say, no, thanks. That doesn't apply to me. That's the real, the tricky thing, but that's how a person makes progress, I think. And it's also how a teacher can bring their A game. If I felt like my students were hanging on every word and going to absolutely do whatever I said, I wouldn't say anything. I'd be too scared. But if I feel like they're kind of willing participants in this kind of game and that they will reject what they don't need, then I can kind of swing a little for the fences and try to really be honest,
I think I spent a lot of time with this mindset that I had to figure out what my process was. And what I'm starting to realize is that it's more about figuring out how to start a story and that the process might actually change from story to story. I'm wondering if that's something that you've experienced.
Even moment to moment within the story.
Right.
100%. Yeah. And I know, everyone, I still do that. Like I kind of know by now that if I just put something down and get into it, something good will happen. But I don't quite believe that when I'm not doing it, But so that's where, you trust your process. And as you're very astutely saying, you don't have to be able to articulate your process.
Right.
It's kind of like, if you went to a party, how you don't stay in the parking lot going, how do I behave at parties? I'll have to remember at 8:06, you just kind of go, I've done this before. And you go in. And that gives you an incredible amount of freedom and power because you can respond to what's actually happening at the party instead of to your parking lot vision of it. So yeah, I think you're exactly right about that.
And I think that's a skill that writers have to learn or get used to is standing in that parking lot before writing the next story. Because I find that, like you kind of alluded to, for some reason in between stories, I very quickly start to feel like I don't know how to do it anymore.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. It's like in football, they used to say after you need that first hit. Then your nerves go away. So I think that's a good thing to know about oneself, is that, and then that's okay. Like I'll do that now. I'm worried now about the next book, but part of me is going, yeah, well, you always do that. That's okay.
Right.
Just don't do it too much or don't get paralyzed. But it's so, so interesting. And the process itself, it's funny. I read Thomas Merton a long time ago and as I remember it, he was writing about the fact that, in spiritual matters, what you really want to do is be close to God. I know I'm totally making up what he said, but the idea is you want a result that's full body. It doesn't really matter how you get there. It doesn't matter if you can talk about being there. All of that stuff is just sort of like preparatory, and it's even a little empty. If you got into the state, then you're good. So I think it's a similar thing with process. If you are able to sit down and make progress every day, really, who cares how you describe it? Now, when we teach, we try to describe it for exactly the reason you mentioned earlier, reassurance.
Right.
To say, well, here's how it feels for me. And you go, oh yeah, me too. Great. I'm okay.
Well, just as it's really hard to teach writing, it's also hard to discuss writing. The other day you wrote, when writing is good, it defies reduction. As soon as we start discussing, we begin reducing. But that's okay, as long as we remember that if something is beautiful, our attempts to say why it is beautiful will always be a mere approximation. And I couldn't help but wonder what this says about workshopping writing, which has been the backbone of the creative writing classroom for a long, long time. So in your opinion, how should both writers and readers approach the workshop?
Well, one is with a lot of humility and skepticism. It's a process. It developed for economic reasons so that teachers and students could get paid. So it's approximate. That's the one thing. The second thing is there are so many ways to do that thing. So for example, something I'm realizing is the workshop is pretty good at identifying where a story falls off. And actually, in a certain way, that would be great if that's all it did. Like I joked, I think somewhere on Story Club, that ideally it would just be like a color coding system where everybody's got some kind of biometric thing when they're reading, and red means great, or yellow, whatever, green means great, red means, and then you just hand those printouts to the writer, and they go, "Oh God, I got definitely a problem on page 4," and then they figure out what the problem is, because basically, you kind of already knew that, I think. When I send something off and it gets rejected, I usually know why at some level, The workshop spends a lot of time discussing why something's bad and what to do about it. I'm not sure that those are actually all that cost effective, time effective. Like, I think if you tell a student there's a problem here on this paragraph right here on page 6, go and think about it, they'll usually fix it. So I think in my workshops, I'm trying to kind of clip off the place where people start prescribing. Although sometimes it's helpful to prescribe as a model, like just to give an example of what kind of thing you're talking about. But clip off the fixing it. And maybe even you don't have to do quite so much talking about why something isn't good. And then with that, the idea of being specific. Like if you say this story is boring, that's hurtful. And anytime someone said it to me, I'm like, well, up yours, right. That's basically my rewrite. But if somebody can say, okay, first of all, I'm reading this story. I can't say it's boring. Let me see where I first started to feel that it was boring. Oh, okay. It's here on page 2, right in this area. Oh, and usually you can kind of say where it went off and sort of maybe why. And in the process of being increasingly specific about that, you also become increasingly less hurtful. Like if I say, hey, your story's boring, you don't like me anymore. If I say, the story had good energy up until about page 2, and then there was a slight deflection of energy because you repeated the same idea 3 times. Anybody can hear that.
Right.
Mostly they hear the part about the good energy.
Right.
And then so I think it's specificity is something in workshop that's really important. At its worst, a workshop is a sloppy, personal set of opinions, like being on a chat line or something, and at its best, it's a specific enumeration of what your reading process was like, and that can be valuable.
Well, it seems to me that's what you're really trying to teach people with A Swim in a Pond in the Rain, and now again with Story Club, is to read a story really attentively and say, what did I feel moment by moment? And start to hone that skill of identifying where something resonates. And conversely, in your own work, recognizing when the energy drops off.
That's exactly beautifully said. Yeah. It's basically saying that cause and effect is real. So if you are thrilled by a story, it happened for some particular reason related to the arrangement of the sentences and paragraphs. And we can discern that. And now again, the trick is, okay, having figured that out, what does that tell us about our own work? But that first step is really important, I think, to say, art, it feels so lovely and so mysterious and so all-encompassing, and it is. But, when you're crying at the end of a symphony, something happened to you that you could actually delineate step by step. And so the idea is that to be the creator of such a symphony, it might be useful to go through that process, to kind of get it into your body. And in a certain way, for me anyway, maybe as a former engineer, it's stress reducing to say, I moved at the end of Araby by James Joyce because Joyce is a great writer. Oh shit. Because then the only note to self is be a great writer.
Right.
I can't, but if I go, okay, yeah, I was definitely moved. Let me see if I can recreate the experience of reading it and see where I started to buy into this thing. Then that leaves me something to work with, So at one point, for example, in Araby, I always get roped in when he's writing about that neighborhood because it reminds me of my neighborhood. And then I go, okay, so why? And then you're able to go down to a certain phrase. Oh, this is the one that rang my bell and made me think of Chicago in 1970. That kind of stuff is handy, I think. It gives you a kind of a rope line to try to accomplish that nebulous thing, being a great writer.
And it seems that one of the keys is specificity, right? I've heard you talk about this time and again. In revision, trying to be as specific as possible, you're more likely to resonate with people.
I think so. Although, again, I kind of stumbled on how important that was to me when I was writing that Russian book. But then I also know, as a counterexample, that there's a certain kind of student writing that is so heavy with detail that you can't get through it.
Right.
I used to do that. On the blue counter, there were 17 keys, right. Each of which, and you describe each key. So, the cool thing is, again, about autopilot, every time we develop a principle in fiction, we ought to have a built-in, on the other hand clause in it. And that's what makes it so hard. It's like that. It's like Goldilocks, it can't be too big or too small. It's got to be just right.
Right.
So I think part of what we do is when we say specificity, okay, if there's somebody who hasn't thought of it that way, it might help her to think of it that way a little bit. But if that's all she's thinking of, for sure, it won't work. So that's why it's a lifelong pursuit. It's so elusive,
Well, as I mentioned earlier, both A Swim in a Pond in the Rain and Story Club both touch on the ways in which life and fiction influence one another. And it got me thinking about writing and spirituality and how the writing process might help us become happier, kinder people. So, for example, I think of Donald Barthelme and his idea of not knowing what a story is about when we're writing it. This idea of being comfortable with the process, letting the story come to us, being open to possibilities, good or bad, and trusting ourselves to adjust as we go. I know you're a practicing Buddhist, and this sounds a lot like meditation and mindfulness to me, like learning to let go, to let life come to you, to shed expectations and be present. So what have you learned specifically from the process of writing that you've applied to your everyday life?
Yeah, well, I think it's what you just said. I mean, the idea that, for me, I think of the word rumination a lot, and in reference to the kind of thinking that we do to locate ourselves in the world. Who am I? What do I want? What's wrong with this situation? Why is that guy so mean? What's wrong with my car? And that's really useful. But I have a lot of that. I've always had, since I was a little kid, I have extreme monkey mind. And, so I think for me, it's something, what I learned from writing was when you're in that mode of concentration, and for me, it has a lot to do with concentrating on the sound of the sentences and also to a certain extent their logic and their efficiency. That's kind of a suite of things I'm worried about. When I'm doing that, I'm ruminating much, much less in those instances when I'm doing that. Okay. And then I noticed with my first book, that was the first time I went, oh yeah, like you said earlier, the process is all you have to start, and you have to kind of operate by a certain feeling, let's say, or maybe it's a set of principles that are embodied in a certain feeling. But I really learned to trust that process. I remember feeling really like, oh my God, this is amazing. I don't have to even think about writing when I'm not doing it. I just have to sit down, get into that mindset, and something interesting will come of it. That then started to speak to my life. And this was coincident with the time I started meditating. You could go into a situation and become aware of how much rumination you were doing, i.e. worrying about the situation, sometimes even as you were in it. Conversely, if you could get that ruminating to quiet down and concentrate on the actual moment-to-moment energy, you were better in that situation. What I found mostly was I was responding with more tenderness to people because I wasn't full of thoughts about my own inadequacy and insecurity and stupidity and blah, blah, blah. So somehow there was the goal in both things became ruminate less. And then in the process of ruminating less, watch how something else arises to replace, or to use that energy that you would have used ruminating. So there is a connection. I'm not sure, it's not like, it's not linear, and I haven't quite figured it out. The other thing I'm finding, and this is kind of it was a hard realization for me, is that at this point in my life, writing is really important to my well-being, like my peace of mind. If I get into a time when I'm not writing, I get kind of grouchy and a little depressed. So now, I mean, the way I justify that as well, that's 4 or 5 hours a day when you're not ruminating, where you're actually feeling a real pleasure and contentment, and then that carries over. But I think there's a connection. I'm not sure what it is, but I'm sure that for everybody, that's part of the fun of it, is that we feel there's a connection. And yet we have to reckon with the fact that a lot of writers are real assholes, and, so it's very interesting stuff. But I think too, like the idea that when you're writing a story in a first draft, you're doing some sloppy projection. You write a story about this gas station attendant. You don't know one, so you just put something down, and it tends to be, for most of us, I think it tends to be a little bit cartoonish and condescending at first. But by applying a writing process, often that person will become more three-dimensional, which I think you could make the case that that's a form of respect or love or something like that. That even if he turns out to be a real jerk, to see him with more dimensionality is somehow mimics what we try to do in the real world. Where you meet somebody and you try to see them in their wholeness instead of as a caricature, something like that.
Well, I think that's really well put. And I really appreciate you stopping by and talking with me today. Just so listeners know, you can find Story Club at georgesaunders.substack.com. We'll put that link in the show notes on our website, mfawriters.com. As of right now, everything is free, but soon some of the content will move behind a paywall. So if listeners want to get all of the content, it'll cost $50 for the year, which is less than one graduate school application. So I highly recommend joining the club. I want to give you the last word here. Is there anything we missed? Anything you want to add about Story Club or writing in general?
Well, I think I love the opportunity to talk to people who are in or considering MFA programs, because it's, you hear a lot of negative stuff about MFA programs, but I have always been an advocate for them, mainly because depending on the program, it can be anything. It can be really obnoxious, and it can be, kind of cultish, or it can be, life-changing and wonderful. So I think the trick is to, vet them really well. If you can, talk to students who are in them now and see what the difference is between the sales pitch and the reality. And then the other thing is to go into it saying, I've used this metaphor probably too much, but this idea that the writer who is not, the young writer is running through the woods on a winter day with ice skates on. And it's a lot of work, and it's frustrating, and it's confusing, and you don't know what's good, and you don't know if you've got what it takes and all that. Then if an MFA program is good, it's kind of like a frozen pond that appears in front of you. So you're still heading in your direction. You're still using your own energy, but hopefully things just get a little easier, So if you enter it in that spirit, and as I said earlier, a little bit self-protectively, I think it can really be, it can be a positive thing. And, so that's, and I wish everybody luck. It's a hard life, especially in a culture like ours where, art has kind of been, made a second class lifestyle, unfortunately. And, but I think it's really admirable. And I think it's something I still really believe in after all these years.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. I really enjoyed your questions.